Started it? Sir. Yeah. Right. Uh, shall we begin? Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining. I would like to introduce the speaker first, and then I can hand over the stage to him. The speaker for today is Dr. Bhaskarjit Nyok. He's an associate professor of philosophy at JNU. He studied at IIT Kanpur, Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Linköping University in Sweden, and Goethe University in India. His primary research interests are in ethics, social ontology, moral and political philosophy, and the philosophy of religion. He has been an Endeavour Research Fellow at the Australian National University and Charles Sturt University, Australia, and a visiting resident scholar at the Centre for Human Values at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Today, he will be discussing from his latest book, What Responsibility, Whose Responsibility? We hope to have a fruitful discussion, and maybe that this discussion will motivate you to engage with this work in detail. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Abhishek. Thank you, Priyanka, for this invitation. I'm really grateful to you all for putting this together during this extended Holy Week and giving me this opportunity to come here and to talk about my book. Title is What Responsibility? Whose Responsibility? It's been 6 months. I think it came out in October, so I've already started hating the book. But anyway, I'm really delighted to be here. It's a tiny little book. I have a copy. I just maybe I okay. Yeah, yeah. So this yeah. Yeah, you don't need to. I can open it. Yeah. So really delighted to be here. It's a tiny little book, not even a half of the bibliography of Arupda's latest book, less than 200 pages, with a miniature font. Really miniature, it's such a scale that, it'll make your eyes bleed if you read 2, 3 pages. Thanks to Rothlese's, cost-cutting recent policies. I hope Routledge is not listening to me. Anyway, so the book has 5 chapters and an introduction and a conclusion, and the South Asian edition is also out just a few weeks back. Yeah, so let's talk about it then. Yeah, so let me start with the title first. The title is What Responsibility? Who's responsible? The title sounds somewhat similar to a very important work in the area of moral and political philosophy called Whose Justice, Which Rationality by Alistair McIntyre. I'm sure most of you would know that Alistair McIntyre is one of the major figures in communitarian philosophy. Uh, and but this book, in this book, I'm not at all talking about communitarian philosophy or communitarianism as such. Although the book talks about collectives, groups, but these discussions don't really refer to any social groups or religious group as such. The word collective or groups is used in a technical sense here. Okay, so that's the first clarification. So there's an interesting story also behind this name. A friend of mine, when I first revealed that it's called What Responsibility and Whose Responsibility, his response was very funny. He says it truly captures the moral plot of my kitchen. So how? When I am there with my wife, our talks begin with this. If we don't do our dishes on time, we'll start accusing each other and it starts with the responsibility question. Once that gets clear, then we go to the whose part, and that's where it gets really, really very tricky. So it is about indeed about a philosophical quibble. It's a quibble about collective responsibility. The book is called Collective Responsibility, right? It primarily investigates these two questions. One is question of the nature of collective responsibility. The other is the subject to the collective responsibility. That's what it refers to. The title refers to. Okay. Is this is a very sort of everyday concept that we use all the time. But is this phenomenon or practice collective responsibility? Is it really real? Or is it somewhat metaphorical in nature? And what kind of responsibility is collective responsibility? This is a question that really sort of so the book basically offers a modest ground of responding to some of these questions and some other interconnected questions. It basically aims to redeem this ordinary concept by construing a robust account of collective agency, an agency that is reflected or manifested in actions, in actions, and you know, emotions of collective entities. And throughout the book, throughout these chapters, it develops a non-individualist account of collectivism. In a non-individualist position or a what I call quasi-collectivist position. And this quasi-collectivist position is located in these two approaches, what I call collectivism and individualism. Collectivism of collective responsibility and individualism of collective responsibility. I'll talk about it in greater details as we go forward. Okay, I'll talk about this now. Yeah, so the statements of collective responsibility are fairly common. We talk about group responsibility, collectives, obligation, and so on and so forth all the time. Half of our everyday conversation is actually filled with moral and evaluative statements about groups and collectives, right? And our public sphere or the moral political sphere is all about the question of collective responsibility. We blame corporations, we blame committees, countries, communities for doing disgusting things to humanities. We hold societies, states, and organizations responsible for causing harms or wrongdoings. We also criticize churches, trust, institutes, NGOs for not living up to the expectations that matter to us. So the list goes on. We do that all the time. Whenever we talk about institutions, we talk about their responsibilities. Now, the term responsibility is used. Remember, this is the moral sense of it. So, in the moral sense, we use it in two different contexts. One is forward-looking sense of responsibility, and the other is backward-looking responsibility. So we can hold somebody morally responsible for doing something, right? So that is backward-looking or retrospective sense. So you hold somebody accountable, morally accountable for doing something, then you hold it for having done that. So that's the reason you think that the person deserves to be blamed. There's also forward-looking. So the forward-looking sense, is all about obligations, so duties. When we talk about group responsibility or group obligations, we talk about in the forward-looking sense. That means you hold these groups or collectives, or for that matter, individuals, morally accountable for doing something. As a parent, as a teacher, you have certain obligations. So in our everyday moral sphere is, it's full of these two senses of the term responsibility. So often we mix it up, and that's where the confusion arises. We don't know whether we are talking about moral obligation or we are talking about their retrospective responsibility or a responsibility as such. So this and a great deal of confusion about that. So this is very, very crucial. We must be very clear that these two senses have to be separated from each other. Okay. But then this, even though it is very common, it's an everyday affair. We use it all the time. We are quite confident of making statements about groups and collectives. Uh, for philosophers, not just for philosophers, in fact, for political theorists, this is somewhat a futile exercise. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense because it's just a figurative way of talking about the responsibility of constituent members. For them, responsibility has to come down to human individuals as constituent. At the group level, we can talk about responsibility in the causal sense and in the legal sense, but not in the moral sense. And this is very, very important. So a lot of philosophers think that this is an incoherent concept. It doesn't have a strong theoretical foundation, and that's why it must be rejected. Whatever discussions you want to have about it, you can talk about it only in terms of a already established concept called individual responsibility, which is beyond any doubt. I mean, that's there. Theoretically, it's very robust and it has enough theoretical stance. So that's the argument that these sort of people offer, that this is incoherent, it doesn't make sense. This is just it's a metaphorical way of talking about individual responsibility. So there's this very interesting philosopher called Jane Narvison. It's very famous libertarian philosopher. He thinks, he made a very sarcastic remark. He said that holding groups or collectives morally responsible is nothing but waving a flag or writing poetry. So it's that it doesn't really have any meaning, any moral meaning in it, right? So that's the position. Uh, and then there are tons of good arguments against it. Why do you think that this is philosophically or theoretically or social scientifically incoherent? Because collectives or groups are not the kind of entities that can be meaningfully held morally accountable, right? You may hold them figuratively responsible for their actions or inactions, but collectives or groups, queer collectives or queer groups, cannot be really held morally accountable. And that's the main argument. That's number one. So there's another very strong argument, and it says that, of course, collectives don't have minds. It's kind of it's a truism, right? They don't have minds, only the constituent individual members. Right? They do not have consciousness like individual human persons. They cannot form beliefs, intentions, and desires to be able to do something morally meaningful, right? Only in their name, individual constituent individual members can be said to have those beliefs, desires, and intentions. But collectives, as such, of course, they don't have, right? They cannot be said to have. So that's why it makes no sense to talk about their responsibility in the truest sense of the term. Can use it in a figurative way, not in a substantially moral sense. And they do not have any emotional profile, as it were. Moral agents. When you talk about moral agents, you have to think through the emotional side of one's agential capacities. And groups of collectives, definitely, they don't have, right? It makes sense to sort of say that somebody's an entity, a group C is sort of feeling bad for doing something, so on and so forth, but it really doesn't say much. So that's another very strong argument that groups or collectives do not have that emotional profile of their own, and that's why they cannot be held morally accountable. And lastly, when you talk about collective responsibility in the strict sense of the term, it actually reifies social structures. It reifies certain other, abstract entities related to the composition of groups. So that's another very crucial, argument that goes against possibility of collective responsibility. So this would basically suggests that no, that must be rejected, that must be resisted, and it is important for us to philosophically come up with a good explanation why moral responsibility of groups, why collective moral responsibility does make sense. It does have its philosophical ground, and we can substantiate that claim with proper arguments. And that's the job that this book does. So, okay, let's talk about this movie. Uh, I'm sure most of you have seen this movie. I saw it a couple of times. It's a very interesting movie called Outbreak, and it is about a deadly virus called Motaba. Right? It's a virus that goes out of control accidentally and infects the whole of California city. It was actually secretly, brought from Africa by the U.S. military, and they wanted to use it as a biological weapon. But because of carelessness on the part of some of their high echelon officials in the U.S. military setup, it goes out of control, and as a result, it kills thousands of people. The reason that I'm talking about this movie is that there's an interesting dialogue that goes on between these two guys. This guy called Billy Billy Ford and Sam Daniels. Billy Ford is played by Morgan Freeman, and Sam Daniels is played. The character is played by Dustin Hoffman. Are you able to see it?
You can read the.
Are you able to read the text? No. Can we make it slightly larger? Is that all? Is it better?
Do you guys want to come a bit ahead?
Uh,
Or the last benches were open?
I think from here.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll read it. Okay. So it's in the middle of the movie, and I found interestingly I was almost in a deathbed when COVID started. In 2000, yeah, it's 21, and that's when I saw, and I was drafting my third chapter, so I thought that let's put it. It's going to be there forever. So I found this dialogue very intriguing, and in a way, it gives me that actual plot for this book. This dialogue, it's of 2 minutes, I think less than 2 minutes. It goes like this. This character called Sam says, tells Billy, you knew about Ottawa all along. E1101 was the antiserum. You could have stopped this outbreak before it mutated, but you didn't. Then Billy says, we couldn't. Sam says, we. Then Billy says, we. Sam says, we. Billy says, that's all we need to know. Then Sam says, no, I want the host. It's about the monkey, which is the host. You got to tell me what the host is serving. Then Billy says, we never found the host. We had to synthesize this antiserum, and it goes on. So then Sam gives this explanation. Sure, to protect the troops, but now the virus comes here and 2 kids die, and we could have stopped it right here, but we couldn't. But we do not because we want to protect the perfect biological weapon. But then the virus mutated, and we cannot stop it now. And we could have that. Then Willie says, the decision was made in the interest of national security. Very important phrase. At that time, it was felt we could afford a certain number of losses. Sam says, Ruby is infected. Billy says, sorry. Then this is the last important bit. Sam says, is we sorry? Too? Billy says, we is responsible for a town dying. We is a particle cessus dying. My wife dying. So that's how it goes on. So it's very interesting because this is what happens when you talk about collective responsibility, right? Uh, it's the plot is different. Of course, it's about a very structured entity called the U.S. Army, but it could also happen in other kinds of cases, like uh, you know, at the institutional level, it could also happen, uh, uh, sort of a murder, a group murder or something, or a mob lynch, that kind of thing. It could also happen in that cases, right? So what's happening here is that Sam is here actually accusing Billy of hiding behind that we narrative, right? So that's where the problem is. Billy, on the other hand, suggests that it's in the name of the collective, namely the USM, and it's all right to do some sacrifice at the individual level. And Billy Ford here is in a way endorsing a collectivist position because Billy is talking about the we, so which is a very collectivist way of talking about the group or the collective, right? But Sam Daniel seems to be invoking an individualist position in the sense that he's talking about the responsibility of those who were in the higher position, who could have avoided it, who could have stopped it, right? But they were not doing that, and that's the reason there's a sort of debate going on between these two. So, in a way, if you look at it reflectively, Billy Ford is right because he's right in the sense that in making the entire army, the U.S. Army, subject of responsibility, right? But he's not right when he uses the term we as a subject for concealing the moral flaws of individual military officers, right? And Sam finds it very sort of controversial. It is unethical. It cannot sweep things under the carpet because you are holding some position, and that's why you don't have anything. You can do whatever you want to do in the name of the collective. That is terrible, and that cannot be allowed. So this, in a way, sort of uh, tells you what happens in a situation like this in a collective action, collective obligation situation. So if you analyze this whole situation, you come across at least three sets of issues. So that's what I think. The first is about the ontology of we. Well, what is this thing called we? How is this we to be defined? Is this we an entity itself? The we first person, plural pronoun. It's very confusing in a way. It doesn't. It seems to refer to an entity in some sense, but then it doesn't really say anything what it really refers to, and that's where the explanatory gap lies. One of the major arguments could be that. The other important thing is about trickling down effects, what I call trickling down effects. Now, when you talk about collective responsibility in the truly collectivist sense, in the sense Billy Ford is talking about here, then are you not talking at all about moral responsibility of individual persons, individual members, individual army officers in this case? Are or you are actually talking about their responsibility when you are talking about the responsibility of the U.S. Army. What is it exactly going on here? Are all, if that's the case, then are all individuals more equally morally responsible, right? Or are they responsible only to the extent of their individual contribution to the collective outcome? What is it? One has to really come up with a proper, good explanation, an effective explanation. That's one setup. The second setup. The third setup is again very, very crucial and is invariably sort of goes in any sort of discussion, collective responsibility, and that is the interpersonal relationship or what I call normative relationship. How do the individuals judge each other and their contribution vis-a-vis the collective outcome? You know, take for instance any sort of collective action situation. We go for, let's say, a protest, a turnout. You're going for a turnout. You are going ahead with a bunch of people, and and of course you are going to judge the opponent, right? Because of certain things, you are going ahead with the protest and saying that this is not all right, so on and so forth. But at the same time, and there's going to be a sort of an outcome for sure. But at the same time, you are also there's something going on within the collective that you have just formed in the name of that protesters, right? And under some banner. So what kind of relationships can these individuals have when they judge each other? Suppose somebody is not really looking very sort of committed to the protest, but going there just to make his friends happy, because, or somebody is not very half-hearted, just going there for some other reasons, not really committed to the outcome of that action. So, what kind of relationship that you see there between the individuals? That is something very, very crucial. And and what do these individuals owe to each other insofar as their collective outcome is concerned or role is concerned? And how do they regulate each other normatively? They keep judging each other, right? And that is something that needs to be understood in order to get a complete picture of the collective composition, the composition that the collective has, and that is very, very crucial. And that's the third important issue. Okay. Uh, yes. Now, when you talk about collective responsibility, a bit of a history now. It's not a new concept. It's not something that I'm talking about here in this book. It's there because it's there in our everyday life situation. Everybody talks about. But if you look at the history, if you look at the moral philosophical writings in the last 50 years or 70 years, you honestly say you don't come across any solid theory. You won't get it even in political theory textbooks. You won't get in any ethics textbook or moral philosophy textbooks. You don't really get a substantial theory. Of course, talks were there when the Second World War happened. Lots of people talked about it, right? I mean, the first book that came out on German and nationalism, it was the question of German guilt in '46 by Karl Jaspers. And there, this concept was used, and Jaspers did talk about German guilt in the context of collective responsibility for killing the Jews and so on and so forth. But then it was not really developed. There was a paper in '48, Journal of Philosophy. There, this concept was completely rebutted. It's a bogus thing. It doesn't really make sense for theorists, for philosophers, because it is very tribalistic way of apportioning moral blame to a bunch of people, because there are major issues there. What happens that when you blame a bunch of people together, it could also be the case that some individual members are innocent, so they have to take the moral burden for things that they didn't commit, right? They were not responsible for. And that is what I call the liberal principle. I should have talked about it a bit before, but that's where the problem lies, because that you cannot hold someone morally responsible when that person is innocent. That's the last thing that you could sort of think about, right? That goes against the basic principle of liberty, right? So that is the fear that most of these political philosophers, moral philosophers have, that this concept is very sort of very regressive. You hold a bunch of people morally accountable for doing something, for some action or omission, but that is, in a way, very, very, it goes against the principle of natural justice. It goes against the principle of basic liberal principles, because it's going to harm some individuals who are innocent. It's going to blame somebody who is not morally guilty for that. You cannot hold somebody guilty for the action and omission of somebody else, right? Cannot be in the name of the collective. And that's why this whole slogan. You see the significance of this slogan when you hear "not in my name" or "not in our name." So that's where it comes from. So that is the major concern. How do you then make sense of it? If you have to protect that principle at the beginning, or I mean, that's the first thing that you have to ensure. Now, how do you then make sense of collective responsibility in all kinds of contexts that 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 we have, I mean, that we talk about? So if you look at the literature, yeah, there isn't any theory. I mean, that's a claim that I'm making. But then, in last 20, 25 years, a lot of people have taken it very seriously, and because of certain things that happen in the area called philosophy of mind and philosophy of action. So in 90s, late 90s, people like John Searle, Michael Bradmel, Margaret Gilbert, a bunch of analytic philosophers came up with a very interesting theory called collective intentionality. So it's about a sort of a claim that mental states or collective intentional states can be meaningfully non-metaphorically attributed to groups or collectives, and that can be proven effectively, theoretically. And that's where it began. If we have a very solid thesis of collective intentionality, then perhaps it would make sense to talk about collective responsibility in a robust sense. Because what happens is that collective intention or intentionality will take care of the condition called mens rea. I mean, that's what we always look for, right? When you hold somebody morally accountable for something, you always talk about the intention. Did you really do that? Did that person commit this crime intentionally, right? So the cause or the intentional state has to be located. I mean, law also looks for it all the time. Or was it an accident? If it was not an accident, was there an intention? Was it deliberate? Right? That's the first thing that we look for in the case of individuals. And that the same case should be in the case of collectives as well, right? How do you make sense of that? And this is why now, if you look at the recent judgment, ICJ judgment, whether states can be held morally accountable for genocide. So there's a huge debate going on that no, it's not possible. Until 2007, there wasn't any judgment, any statement by ICJ or other organizations that suggested that yes, it is possible. Nuremberg trial is the biggest sort of example. Nowhere it was mentioned that the entire country should be held accountable. Some of these judges in the trial appeared to be a bit collectivist, did sound a bit collectivist, did sound that yes, they can be held morally accountable, but then there's a huge, backlash. Nobody accepted. If you look at the literature, you'll find it. And even interestingly, Hannah Arendt was famous for her writing on trial. She also doesn't talk about it in substantial. The concept was there in her writing, but not in the substantial form. Because she also doesn't believe that collective can be or should be held morally accountable in a substantial sense, like the way an individual human person can be. Right. So this debate is going on, and I was talking about ICJ. So the 2007 judgment that against Serbia, they did say something, but then they didn't hold Serbia morally or legally accountable for genocide as such. And also, I think in 2002 when ICC came out, then it was a kind of a sort of a huge, benefit to the individualists as it were, because it came up with this sort of agenda that they are going to investigate only individual sort of persons, only cases of individual crimes, not collective crimes, not genocide, not any sort of wrongdoings done by a nation or a state or the collective entities. Right. So that's the history. That's the sort of that's where it comes from. This whole issue. Now, but in last 20, 25 years, if you look at the literature, as I say, because of this development taking place in philosophy of mind and philosophy of action, a lot of people started thinking that let's do it. Perhaps we will be able to come up with something very, very substantial, and that's how it started. But then again, within that camp, you have a very interesting bunch of people. They said, no, that's not possible. So they again sort of rebutted that collective responsibility just doesn't make sense. So if you look at these papers the last 25 years, you will find these two approaches, what I call individualism and collectivism. And when I analyze, I found that these two approaches are very exclusionary in their in their attempts, and they often talk past each other while addressing the common concerns. And it's not really clear whether they're addressing the same phenomenon or they're addressing something else. So it's not clear whether they're climbing the same mountain from two different sides or they're climbing two different mountains altogether. Uh, 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 so these are the branches of individuals have sort of developed these two process. Philip Pettit uh, is one of the major figures. Peter Franz, Gilbert, and others, and the individualists you have David Lewis, Seamus Millers, and others. Anyway, so now what's happening with these two processes that they are going ahead with their agenda of talking about collective responsibility. Individualists are developing a more sophisticated individualist way of talking about collective responsibility without really reducing it to individual responsibility. Likewise, collectivists are also going ahead with their agenda of talking about collective responsibility in a very sort of unconcerned way, not ready to really think what the individualists are saying. So these two approaches are going together parallelly, but they are not really, there isn't any interaction everywhere. So I thought that let's sort of find out something here between these two approaches. So when I sort of analyzed and I found that there are four major questions that could be posed against these two positions. The first one is about what I call residuary responsibility, where I ask the question whether moral responsibility of individual members in a collective situation can really capture the essence of what they have to say about the collective being, right? So that's about uh, uh, whether the collective is right in saying what they're saying. The second is about the individual, whether the individual is indeed right in saying what they're saying, whether it really captures the essence of collective responsibility. Then the second question is about supra-individuality, whether groups or collectives really enjoy an unqualified ontological status separated from the constituent individuals. That's the question posed to the collectivists, because they seem to be suggesting that queer collectives can be said to have an agency status of their own. So that's why it makes sense to hold them morally accountable in the most literal sense. So that's the question that I'm posing to the collectivists. Whether you were talking about a supra-individuality, which is being held accountable for the actions which are brought in by the individual member. Then the fourth question is about autonomy compromising character. So the existence of collectivity at the non-individual level often sort of in a way threatens the autonomy of agency abilities of the individual members. The moment you talk about collectivity, in the explanation of the composition of collective, when you suggest that there is something called collectivity present, there's a theoretical problem there because it is going to really threaten the autonomy of individual members, right? And that is something that the individualist is not ready to accept at any time. What about the libertarians? They are anyway not going to accept it. But even the liberals will not really accept this belief. So that's the question that I'm posing, whether that can be at all evidence. The last is about the indetermination. The indetermination is about when you talk about collective responsibility in the global sense, whether it really precludes what we have to suggest about the individual responsibility, because that's not where it ends when you talk about collective responsibility. It has to come down to the individuals at the end of the day, right? But then there is also a risk. The moment you reduce it to individual responsibility, something gets out of the group, because many a time things are done in the name of collective. So the collective has to be spotted on, and then the problem is that how do you make that feasible? How do you make it explanatorily possible without really subscribing to any metaphysically doubtful entity called collectivity? That's the challenge. So what I do here is that, and this is where I stand, what they say versus what I say, right? So the individualist, I suggest, takes an affirmative stance towards number one and number three, and negative stance towards number two and number four. Then the collectivist, I suggest, takes an affirmative stance to number two and number four, and a negative stance towards number one and number three. So this book basically offers a negative response to all these four questions. Right. Neither it, because it talks about collective responsibility and collective responsibility without really reducing it to the issue of individual moral responsibility. And there it talks about a non-individualist approach, a quasi-realist or quasi-collectivist non-individualist approach. Okay. Anyway, so that's the general sort of picture about the book. This is whatever I say here so far. It's the beginning of the book, and the first two chapters, introduction, and then the sort of first chapter you get that plot. I mean, that's where how I sort of set it up. Now, the main task of the rest of the book is to justify that, right? Now, third, fourth, fifth, all these chapters are all about justification. First justification is about collective intent, collective intentions. How and in what sense can you talk about collective intentions in the strict sense of the term, in the literal sense? And second is about collective agency. Like a moral agency is, I mean, traditionally or conventionally is always about individual moral agency. Now, whether we can talk about collective moral agents, that's the challenge that has been taken up in fourth chapter. The last chapter is about emotions. I mean, emotions are very interesting sort of phenomenon. They're there. It looks like very absurd to talk about emotions of groups or emotional states of collectives. But then when you talk about apology, group apology, and that's something that we often get to hear, right? Companies coming out and seeking apology in the highest court of the country. These are normal things, right? But when you try to understand what is it to make an apology, legally or morally, it's all about addressing your emotional concerns, putting it out that yes, we were guilty, yes, I was guilty. So how do you make sense of that in the context of that? So that's being taken up here in this book, in the fifth chapter. That's where I talk about basically, with reference to a particular emotional state called guilt. So the question of collective guilt. And there, that's the justification. That's the emotional justification of collective emotions. How emotions can be justified at the collective level in the collectivist sense, right? I'll talk about. But anyway, so I'll just sort of give you a brief. How much time do you have? Like, Abhishek, another.
Maybe we can see if we can finish it by 4 o'clock.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all these chapters because that's bit sort of it's going to be very monotonous because that's where the main theoretical technical things are there, but I don't really want to talk about it here. But I just want to present the meaty part of the argument that I developed in the fourth chapter. and which I think is the crux of the whole book, and it's about collective agency. Now, what is it when I talk about agency and status of a collective entity? It could be an entity of two people, it could be an entity, it could be an institution, it could be a group, it could be a committee, it could be a group of villagers. So the book first starts with these three cases. The first is about Kodaikanal, is uh, the disaster that happened in Kodaikanal. And then it talks about the money violence 2004, not the recent one, the Panorama Devi case. And the third one is from a movie called The African Doctor. Have you watched this movie? It's about a resident. It's about a doctor who was brutally attacked by a villagers, very conservative villagers in a French village. And how it happened and what kind of justification, things like that. So that's how the book starts. Anyway, so what is this thing called collective agency? What do I mean by it? As such, it's not really very new. It is there. People talk about it, but they talk about it fairly, in a metaphorical way. Actual sense agency, they would say that cannot be located in a collective entity. Uh, but in law, I mean, they are held morally accountable, right? Legally accountable for doing certain things, right? But then there, the collective entity is interpreted as a person, not really a collective entity as collective entity, right? Which is a personification of an entity and then giving them a legal status, legal rights, legal facilities or whatever they are entitled legal. That's a very easy way of doing it. That's not the solution that I'm looking for here. Right. So this guy called Pope Innocent, in just a bit of a sort of history, why and how this whole thing of collective agency was rejected, and why people thought that this is absolute nonsense. This slide talks about that. So this guy says that this something called persona ficta, collective entities are fictional person, and it cannot really excommunicate them. I mean, that's the concern. This was actually from the Council of Lyons in 1246. That's when Pope Innocent IV said that that's just not possible. Universities cannot be held morally accountable, or churches cannot be held morally accountable for whatever. Right? They do not have a body to be kicked. Somebody said, a very famous jurist, British jurist said it. They do not have a body to be kicked. They do not have a soul to be damned. So it makes sense that they are not the right entities. Right. And then the Cartesian philosophers, following Descartes, they argue that agency basically presupposes a non-material soul. They need to have that, whatever way you understand, could be metaphorical or literal, but soul has to be there, self has to be there. If you want to entertain an entity as a moral entity, an entity subject of morality, that's not possible with separate entities. Collective, because collective agency or collective, whatever you call it, it doesn't have any biological base, right? And then, in Hobbes' Leviathan, these are things that I discuss in the fifth chapters in detail, and I have arguments against each one of these. Leviathan chapter, I think chapter 15 and 16, where Hobbes sort of goes against Descartes' concept of mind. He makes certain observations. There, he thinks that it's just not possible. But in the functional sense, it makes sense to talk about agency, the collective thing. That's again a functional way of talking. Just like the legal, in the court of legal, in a legal court, I mean, what you get is that you treat these entities as if they are collectives, as if they are human persons. That's why you have the personhood status, right? organizations, companies, or universities, these are taken always as persons, not as entities of our sociality. They're treated as persons, but these are as if persons, as it were, because they don't have any biological, constitutions, right? They don't have a mind of their own, right? Of course. So it doesn't really make sense. So Hobbes again sort of expresses his disappointment about this with regard to this idea, and also he goes against Descartes in some other context, but he was very sure that this is not possible. Only in a functional sense, perhaps it would make sense, but otherwise, no way. And this guy was very, very sort of famous for his, rather, I would say, infamously famous for his rejection of collectivism. If you look at economy and society, famous work of Weber is this doctrinal position called methodological individualism, and that's the heart of positivism. That's the heart of most of these scientific explanations. So there, he rejects that any agency other than the participants of individuals in a collective affair would impair or compromise the agency and autonomy of individuals. And that's what I was talking about before when I talked about deliberateness. And that's the fear. They cannot accept the reality of the collective. And that's the fear that Weber had also expressed in his articulation of methodological individualism, and that rejected postmortem. So I have things to talk about against all these people. I'm not going to it's going to take time, but when I sort of construct my position against these people or against these theoretical positions, I begin by asking who is responsible at the end of the day when you are holding a collective morally responsible? Who is that entity? That's the sort of motivating question here. So if you look at a collective context, any explanation, whatever explanation you provide, you'll find three different ways of talking about from the point of view of agency. You can talk about it in terms of individual agency, right? Let's take the example of bunch of people listening to me Zoom like this. Can interpret it entirely in terms of individual agency, that each and every member of this collective is listening to the lecture L, right? That's an individualist way of settling the whole explanation, right? That doesn't give you a good explanation of collective agency, right? It's about the collection of individualism, but that collection of agency is not collective agency, right? So that must be rejected. You can also interpret it in a shared, with a concept called shared agency. If you have a shared agency in listening to this talk, you because you are not listening to me alone, you are not listening to this lecture alone. You are listening to this lecture with the rest of the people. So there is a shared aspect of doing what you are doing. So whenever collective wrong or collective wrongdoing or harm takes place, this is what happens. The individuals share the moral burden. Take for instance the pollution. Sort of making a blanket statement, the entire generation should be held responsible for this stupid pollution going on in Guwahati. I don't want to talk about Delhi now here. Should be talking about Guwahati. Terrible situation. It's our shared burden. Like each and every individual whosoever is using a motor vehicle should be held morally accountable for the pollution. Let's say the pollution comes only from the motor vehicle. That's another way of it. But there's another sense called collective agents, where the collective itself is responsible, irrespective of whether or not individual members are individually responsible for that action. So that possibility, there's a gap, there's a sort of a disjunction between what you can talk about at the collective level and what you can talk about at the individual level. So that disjunction between these sorry, uh, two sets of statements in a way gives you that theoretical sort of avenue to talk about the possibility of collectivity, and this is what I explore here. I talk about it. So, so these are the statements that I am making about the possibility of collective agency. The first is about unity of action and diversity of participating agents. So, what happens in Hobbes is that it takes care, that sort of explanation or account will take care of unity of action, that the individual members are united to do something together, and that's why this is an action that could be, executed to be collective. That's there. But diversity of participating agents, agency, that element or that insight is not taken care of. So if you have to come up with a uh, with a with a with a middle path to solution between individualism and collectivism, this is what you need. What I say, unity of among these are the sort of this is what how you have to synthesize unity of action and what I call diversity of participating agents. So when I talk about unity, there's something called unity in diversity and unity with diversity. So unity in diversity is something what I call collective agency, and that's the explanation that you need. But unity with diversity that I attach with shared agency, which I reject in the previous slides as well. And collective agency is, in a way, it's a single, but it's not singular. Now, what do I mean by that? Any agent, any agency unit is a single unit, right? A nation, a state, a community, a country, a committee, a gang of robbers. Every entity is a single entity, right? In that sense, there is oneness in that. But that is what is often the main entry point, and that's where Hobbes also stops. But that's just one side of the coin. The other side is non-singularity, and that must be equally emphasized. Otherwise, you are not going to get that non-individualist picture, which I'm. So it's a collective agency needs to be understood as a single entity, but not singular. And here I draw a parallel with this concept called unity of consciousness, which is there in philosophy of mind. So when you are talking about consciousness, it's very interesting because these mental states you can be said to have different kinds of mental states at the same time. For instance, now I'm getting a very nice let's say coffee aroma. I'm getting it. At the same time, I also have this vision, the color, red color, and the red and black color in front of me. At the same time, I'm also feeling thirsty. All these things are going on in my mind, and there is a there's a reference point. Who is having these states? It's me who is having this. So there is a unity in having all these conscious mental states. Now, somewhat similar goes on here in the constitution of collective agents. I mean, that's an analogy, but that analogy gives us a good philosophical explanation, and that's what I. Let's say is about the normativity. I was talking about the trickling down effects. So the normativity is very important. How the individuals are interconnected, how their interconnection in a way gives them a perspective towards the other. That is very, very important. That the individual members together they have a point of view, a group point of view, as it were, and that group point of view is the agency point of view. And once that agency point of view is located substantially with proper explanation, then you have a group agency. So this is very, very important because this is what we do in philosophy because we do basically the dirty job for the social science people because you use these concepts recklessly, right? When you talk about consciousness, you talk about consciousness, collective consciousness, but you don't know what that damn thing means when you talk about collective. When you talk about collective knowledge, I mean, This is the problem not just in philosophy, in other disciplines as well. Individualism is really going deep into your explanation. When you talk about knowledge, you talk about the knowledge of a person always. You don't talk about collective knowledge. But when it comes to our ordinary understanding or explanation, we do talk about collective, right? But when you talk about memory, you always talk about individual memory, right? Go to psychology textbook, only will get the theories about individual memory, right? You don't get any theory of collective memory, right? So that's what the problem lies. This individualism has to be, undermined in some sense in order to get a clear picture. And it's just the one side, one part of the entire sort of game plan. I mean, it's now time to collectivize these concepts for not just for philosophers but also for social scientists. When you make a statement about collective knowledge that this tribe knew this all this while, when you make that statement, does it really? In what sense are you making that statement? Are you making a statement about a few individuals of that tribe, or you are making a statement about the generations that knew about athletes, about a medicinal plant or something? One has to be very serious about it, right? Otherwise, this flowery language will bring in a lot of explanatory gaps, and that must be restricted. Anyway, so I want to end this whole thing with one last example, and this is, when that explains this whole thing called non-moral normativity. I'm sure most of you have watched this TV series called Money Heist. So in Money Heist, what happens is that there's this doctor and then his bunch of followers, Berlin, what are those names? And Helsinki and others. So they just follow, and they all know that what they are doing is a wrongful act, right? They are committing a crime. Yet these individuals are committed to do that act together. And that's the reason they're finding good rationale for scolding each other. They're holding each other morally accountable. They're holding them morally accountable for a crime which is morally condemnable. This is very interesting, isn't it? Now, what kind of normativity is being seen here when whether you have really any moral meaning in saying that you haven't, offered me the gun when I needed it most, let's say, right? Now, you know that you are going to loot the bank. That is awful. Your total collective act is wrong, right? Now, in what sense are you holding that person? Now, this normativity is a very peculiar kind of normativity, which is invoked for the constitution of the collective, because otherwise the collective will not survive if you don't have that cementing power, which is a non-moral normativity. Uh, but that's it's a different sort of explanation altogether. We won't explain it here, but that's a very peculiar kind of normativity, and that needs to be explicated appropriately if we want to have a theory of collective responsibility and collective agents, collective moral agents. I don't want to talk about collective emotions because I've already crossed my time. But anyway, thanks for that.
Thank you for that really wonderful presentation. Left all of us with a lot to ponder over, and I'm sure many of us will go back to the book and see how we develop these arguments in full length. We will open for questions. Please, Tushar.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So, uh, wonderful topic. I think it has a bearing on my work as well. So, okay, first question. Okay, Hikesing Dang unpacks the sense of responsibility along three dimensions.
Say the hiking that.
Dang. She works in philosophy of science.
Okay, okay.
So the dimensions are answerability, accountability, and attributability. And so, and I think if you're, if,
I think somebody else. I think this by. Say it again, the name.
Haixendang.
No, I think it was This distinction, right?
Yeah,
Anyway, I'll talk about it.
yeah, sure. Uh, so can it be the case that an individual and the collective come apart along these dimensions in different fashions?
Yeah.
And first and second, the normativity as the cementing power. Okay. So if we understand along these three dimensions, say, who ought to be answerable, who ought to be attributable, causally attributable, and who ought to be accountable, then in the case of radically heterogeneous groups manifested in modern scientific communities working particle physics, how this normativity makes sense along these three dimensions. And third question is uh, about historical contingency. What historical contingency explain the antipathy towards the collectivist positions, the beginning of the
Yeah. Thanks. I think that selecting.
Yeah. Maybe I mean, as is convenient.
Yeah. So the first one, this distinction is, yeah, it holds
Yeah.
in the context of collectives as well. This accountability, answerability, and attributability, right? I really actually, even though I agree with that distinction, it's pretty convincing, but somehow it really doesn't make much sense. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about, you see here, this, I think in one of the first slides, you see, I don't really use I use the word held, HELD, in bracket. So when I say collective is responsible, I'm not using the term collective is held responsible. So, so is responsible and is held responsible, they refer to two different things. You can be held accountable even if there's nobody out there to judge you, right? You can be held morally accountable even if you are not really morally responsible. So the difference is there, sure. But what this particular account is trying to locate is whether it is really responsible. With attributability and accountability, this requires the presence of the other.
Mhm.
That means you can hold somebody morally accountable at the metaphysical level, even if there isn't anybody out there. And that's where morality is such a unique discipline, unique sort of sphere, where it makes sense to hold myself morally accountable, even if there's nobody out there to judge me. And that's how it differs from law. That's how it differs from other normative discourses, religious discourses. So this distinction, I think, doesn't take us too further, but yes, that's there, and thanks for bringing it. Okay. The second one is about, I really didn't know you talked about particle physics or something, right?
Yeah. So the idea is that there can be some cases where the collectivity can be the locus of, say, attributability. And
I don't know about it.
Yeah.
At what level that happens. Uh, but the last bit was interesting. You said about
the historical contingency.
historical.
So about particle physics, or
No, the last question.
the historical contingency that explain the
Why do you have,
so partly my question is
the book also starts with that we are sort of, you're biased towards independence. Always. Theoreticians are always biased towards independence. Right? I mean, they have a very sort of a shortcut way of understanding collective, right? Uh, when you when you when you when you attribute a linguistic ability to a tribe, do you really go after each and every member of the tribe and ask them, do you really know that? Did you know this? Did you, at the cognitive level, does it really make sense? It doesn't, right? So you go with a very summativist account. When most or many people in the tribe know this, then this statement can be attributed to this. But there are problems there in that summativist account. Because many times individuals members can hold the proposition which is very different from the statement that they hold at the collective level. Right? Think about Indian Parliament passing a bill, let's say, or the higher judiciary saying that there's giving this judgment that same-sex relationship is now it's there isn't anything illegal about. But each and every, let's imagine that each and every parliament individually believes that this is not the case, that judiciary is wrong. Yeah, that doesn't mean that you can attribute that statement to the Indian parliament. So there are two things. At the collective level, the same individual can have a belief or a desire or an opinion at the individual level, but when it goes to that platform at the collective level, same individual will not be making that statement as individual. That individual will be making that statement as a member of that collective, right? So there's always a gap between what the individual members individually hold or personally hold and what they hold at the collective level as members. So this gap has to be understood in order to talk about things at the collective level in a substantial sense. Yeah, so the bias is there for various reasons. I think for moral philosophers, at least for philosophers, it's uh, because of the it's ontologically it's very substantial, right? I mean, it's very easy. Like you have a brain and a mind, you have a heart, you have a body, right? It's very easy to talk about things with a flesh and mind entity, but it doesn't make sense to talk about an abstract entity, right? So that's very easy to sort of. But then we do make statements about collectives all the time. Now, how do you really fix it? It has to have some explanatory
Yeah.
sort of. You need to have some explanation there. That's the sort of thing, right?
So, okay. One.
Maybe we'll come back to yeah. Do you have a follow-up question or like a big
Yeah,
question
follow,
or the whole
follow,
question?
follow.
Should we? Okay.
So, the idea of historical contingency was actually predicated on the idea that Kant also applied categorical imperative to nation states as well, no?
No. He never collectivized categorical imperatives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing. I mean, there's all these big always individuals. These individuals, these philosophers are very sure about it, and that's where we have United Nations. I mean, that's where it was picked up from Kant, right? This perpetual peace, uh, and you have now the situation. You don't know how to make a statement about the collective in the robust sense. That's what I was talking about by CJ. Yeah. Sure.
Anirban, do we have a hand from here? Okay, first we go to Anirban and then uh,
Yeah.
Yes.
go ahead.
So, Professor, I understand when it makes a lot of sense when you talk about unity in diversity, when you're talking about non-hierarchical collectives like
Mm.
Dharna, like, people claiming
Mm.
against attendance, or the parliament or the judiciary. There's no hierarchy there, so it makes sense. But when we talk about collectives, where there's a very strict hierarchy, like the military or like a company,
Right.
then the way you talk about mens rea, actus reus, mens rea, actus reus can be done by a lower level grant, but the mens rea would always be attributed back to the commanding officer, be it military, be it, So in that sense, how would this account like seek to address that? Because there you cannot have collective intention. The grant doesn't have intention, so to speak, like, or the lower level officer doesn't know what to like really say as long as its managing director would have told. And another thing I found out is that the Pope Innocent Fourth thing, where you said the person of it, you cannot really attribute or do anything to a so-called fictional person. But I mean, that's a very old jurisprudence. Like in modern jurisprudence, would say that there are fictional people, like the reasonable man. Uh, the reasonable man doesn't really exist, but that doesn't mean the reasonable man doesn't lend us moral guidance or legal guidance, if you want to look at it like very strictly legally. So that
Well, that remains more or less the same. I mean, when you treat these entities more or less as person, it's fictional person. It's not a real person.
no, they are fictional person, but that doesn't mean things cannot be attributed to them. Like a university could not be excommunicated because of the heresy they were doing.
That's what I'm arguing. That's why I'm upset with this guy.
But that's the thing, a reasonable man can lend light as to what a person should have done in that particular sense to have been in the right.
No, I don't know about what you're being why you're talking about reasonable act. That's a different thing. I mean, it's like a concept like perfect market. Even if perfect market doesn't exist, it makes sense to talk about perfect market because it really rationalizes everything, right? The same thing about individual voter, a rational voter. Even if it doesn't exist, it does make sense to talk about
Correct.
the place of rational voter. That's a different debate altogether. I'm not talking about that. That's not the fictitious concept. That's a different.
Okay.
These are two different.
Fine, fine.
Going back to the first point, yes, you were right. About that's a good point about non-hierarchical groups versus hierarchical groups. Yes, my emphasis more or less about non-hierarchical groups, but with the hierarchical groups also the same thing happens. You can get that description, you can get that explanation by looking at the papers, right? A lower rank job holder follows the command of his boss, right? That boss follows the command of the other boss, the higher boss. So there is a trend, right? They follow. I mean, the procedure is established, and the moment they sign up for that entity, they accept that they are going to follow it. So in a way, in a vicarious way, in a way. So that explains that whatever, I mean, it's like the representative democracy, right? Even if you are not voting for UN, when India votes for UN, in a way you are voting because it's being done in your name. Your representative is doing it, right? On paper. That's how the explanation of political scientists will also talk about when they talk about the representations. So I think a good deal of explanation can be obtained from the papers that are circulated, the policy documents, the newspaper sort of briefing about the collective entity, what they think. And if somebody finds a good reason not to go by that, that person will also find a good reason not to be with that entity, right? So it might look very artificial, but that's how it goes. That's how the explanations are settled. Right. Thanks.
Okay, Ritu.
I was just wondering how there's a question of conflict between collective responsibility or individual responsibility. It's was dealt by, let's say, identity units. Let's say that movement
Yeah.
and the sort of movement in India.
Right.
Because this stays at the core of some of those issues where they were raised.
Very nice. Yes. Yes. That's a very interesting question. Yes. I should have made this disclaimer right in the beginning. I don't talk about identity groups. It's about these groups where there is more or less there is a structure. Problem with identity groups is that you really can't fix the agency. That's where the problem when you make a claim about, let's say, gender injustice or caste discrimination. You make a blanket statement about a particular caste or a particular society. And these harms or wrongdoings are going on for several hundred years. So you don't really, it doesn't really make sense to talk about the generation living now and holding them morally accountable for the atrocities that were done by their forefathers, right? The agency is definitely a problem here. Whether this account is will be able to handle that kind of moral claims, I don't have any doubt about that. That this account is not good enough to deal with that kind of problem. But that's it. Identity groups are that's a very different issue altogether. But yes, it does make sense. I mean, when you were saying that whether we are correct in making statements about these identity groups or not, yes, it is possible. But then whether this account is good enough to explain that or not, I'm saying no, it doesn't. Probably we need to have a more sophisticated or more exhaustive analysis to deal with that kind of groups where there is no agency in the strict sense of the term, because agency is normally understood in terms of a decision procedure, in terms of the of a state, of a proposition or a judgment. When you make a statement, a judgment with respect to a group or a collective, it's about subscribing to that statement, subscribing to that judgment. Right.
Now, yes,
Yeah, sure. Now that doesn't happen with identity groups. That's what I mean. Let's sort of abuse this caste because we are higher. That sort of thing, officially or unofficially, probably it's difficult to make that statement. But yet we need to we need to have an account for that. That's true.
yeah,
But
I'm just wondering again. So let's say this identity group transfers or the claims of certain identity groups transforms into a legal concept, historical injustice.
yeah, that's true.
Then is there a possibility that
No, no, it's possible. I'm not denying its possibility. I'm not saying that there isn't any account that could deal with this sort of issues. I'm just making a defense here that this book doesn't deal with identity. I'm not theoretically equipped enough to talk about identity. But yes, I mean, I would say that this is where, I mean, this is where things begin. If you have a good theory about collectives in general, perhaps you would know where to fix the sort of issue, what kind of lacuna that this sort of explanations have, and how to bring in that element to fix that kind of groups. There are all kinds of groups about mobs, right? About pollution. Pollution now intentional states cannot be attributed because nobody really intentionally pollute the air, right? But yet it makes sense to hold individuals morally accountable for driving a gas guzzler, right? But nobody does it intentionally. Now, how do you explain that by looking at this man's real condition? Perhaps we need a different sort of more sophisticated explanation for it. This book basically deals with structure or somewhat less structured groups, like a group of villagers, a community or institutions or a nations doing a crime or a corporate entity doing some crime, doing something together, to make a profit. So that's where it lies. Yes, it doesn't talk about that kind of thing. Yeah.
So, clarification on one. We'll come to first. We'll take your question, then we'll take your question. We'll come to that question.
so?
Please.
Once again, I mean, just as a disclaimer, I'm not trained in philosophy, and whatever if I do use, I mean, certain philosophical concepts, they will be very, very rough around the best case scenario.
Yeah, well, that's better.
So I'm just again just as an amateur. So what I've been thinking the whole time is that how what your synthesis or whatever it is that you're trying to attempt in your work. So if we take the case of let's say the latest scandal that's been happening with Boeing 737, which is to say the planes are being made very badly. The doors are literally being blown out of the cabin mid-air. Planes are having to land. 2 planes have already plummeted into oceans. So I mean, if I take a classic case like that, I'm so glad that you brought up Hobbes and Weber because they're also, I mean, Weber is a methodological individualist. So and if I combine that with a utilitarian approach, a consequentialist approach, I would say, well, the right way to treat this is to say that the guy who was riveting the bolts in the Boeing factory, maybe that guy to some extent was guilty because while he could have said that, okay, he was not doing it properly, he had orders from his higher ups. I'm also thankful to you for bringing that point up. But I could then also say that the guy managing the factory floor maybe had some more bargaining power with the shareholders, so maybe he could be apportioned a little more blame. The current CEO would, of course, have to get the majority of the blame because he was the person telling everyone that we need to start cutting corners to increase our profit margins. But at the end of the day, the company itself as a fictional legal entity also needs to receive blame.
True.
So as to set an example to the larger corporate world that look, you need to get your act in order so that this sort of thing does not happen in any field, be it airlines or be it chemicals or whatever.
Yes.
Now, this is a classic case where I am not saying that we first recognize the collective and then we start, let's say, rationing, responsibility individually from there. This is a ground approach, which is to say, I'm looking at the individuals and I'm saying that whatever collectivist notions of responsibility that we do come up with are all built on that. So it's this classic case of when Marco Polo asked
Kublai Khan, do you see that wall? Kublai Khan said, yes, I see a wall. I don't see anything else. But then Marco Polo said, it's all bricks. I don't see a wall.
Yeah,
But then Marco Polo said, if the bricks are not there, there will be no wall.
Yeah.
And the wall is entirely made of bricks. So it's something like that.
yes,
So,
that's true.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like a classic case of missing the forest for the trees, right?
Exactly.
So that,
But again, I would again actually my idea would be contrary to that. I would say the forest literally is a bunch of trees. It is nothing more than a bunch of
that's what this book also talks about.
Yeah. So what my question here would be, where is that point of departure from your synthesis, from this my maybe relatively simplistic, consequentialist plus methodologically individualist perspective? Question one. Question two is, I'm so sorry for slipping that in.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned Hannah Arendt and the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah.
But one thing from my very cursory reading of history is that the Allied powers, after the victory, were also trying to move away from any notion of blaming the German people because there was a renewed context of the Cold War. So there is also this, concept which calls, talks about the innocent Wehrmacht, which is to say that the West was pushing a narrative that the German army did not really know, what the atrocities were that were taking place. Because now they needed the German army on their side. They were pushing the narrative of an innocent German army that did not know of the Auschwitz and Blumenthal concentration camps.
True.
Right.
True.
So do you think that might have played a role in the Nuremberg trials, not really apportioning blame to the country as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, the second one first.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this case. I mean, there are lots of theories, lots of explanations. I mean, these are dependent, these theme questions are dependent on historical fact. One doesn't know what really happened, right? But there's an interesting distinction between intention and foresight, right? And that's a distinction that often, gives you a very good explanation for ethicists. Even if you don't have an intention for doing an awful thing, were you not able to foresee that? That's the question that should be asked. Even if you didn't have that intention, even if you didn't form any intention to cause the damage, did you not have any idea that if you do this, this might happen? So there's something called doctrine of double effect also. I mean, in ethics, we often, debate over this, whether there's a distinction between killing and letting die. And that's a very sort of ugly war between these two groups, that there is a distinction, there isn't any distinction. And it's used by just war theories also. When you kill a bunch of people, whether you had the intention to kill those people, or it was just a sort of a consequent, this was just a result of, I mean, that's what happens. That's how Truman's act was justified. I also discussed about Truman's decision, whether Truman really had the bad intention to bomb those two cities in Japan, or he was not able to foresee. So there's this philosopher called Elizabeth Anscombe, was a disciple of Wittgenstein. I narrated the whole story here. So when Truman was invited to Oxford University for an honorary degree, she was the only person who stood up and said, no, if this man can be honored, anybody can take Genghis Khan, Hitler, anybody could be honored. He knew it. When he put the signature, he did have that intention. There's a bunch of people who said, no, he just put the signature on the paper. He didn't really intend to kill these many Japanese. So you need an explanation. What is it to have an intention? And how do you explain that for a jurist to give a proper judgment about that? You need to have that explanation. So this is basically it's giving the raw material for this kind of judgment, and it helps in the legal discourse. So that sort of these distinctions have to be made clearly and see where it falls.
So I'm not sure about historical sort of facts where exactly it happened. Going back to the first question, it was about the the position holder. So my last chapter is on guild, where collective guild is interpreted as positional guild, because collective guild is not just a guild feeling that can be talked about at the collective level. It's about the individual members having a positional guild with respect to a particular wrongdoing, and which is brought in by the collective agency there in that case. So here, what happens here is that there is again a distinction, very crucial distinction: institutional responsibility and moral responsibility. These are two different things. Sometimes they are coextensive. Most of the time, they are not. When you have an institutional responsibility, you may or may not have any you may or may not have any moral responsibility, right? These are interesting cases. Like when you are in a sort of a, I think the Oppenheimer movie also shows that those lower ranked officers where they really culpable for where they were contributing to the project. And think about the daily wage laborer, those where they have no idea whatsoever. Now there's also what they were doing is probably they can be held morally, they can be held institutionally responsible for that. But moral responsibility, probably this is at the individual level. You need a different explanation on it. Maybe it makes sense to talk about their institutional responsibility. If you are a part of that institution and organization that does something as awful as this, then it makes sense to talk about your institutional responsibility. If you are sincerely giving a service to the institution which is committed to do this kind of things. But moral responsibility, maybe there one has to come up with a different condition, whether that person really knew that. Of course, if you have, of course, that's why the emphasis is on intentional autonomy of individual members. If I am an autonomous person, I must know what I'm contributing to. If I see that this is something that's leading to something awful, I must come out of that organization, right? Of course, you may be motivated by all kinds of things. There may be incentives, motives, personal interests, and all kinds of things. That's a different thing. But morally, yes, if you have that agency and if you're capable of exercising that agency, you must come out. That's what I was talking about. Even if things are done in the name of the collective, you have an agency. You can raise your hand and say, "No, I'm not a part of this bloody thing. Come do things in my name." Right? So that's possible, I think, with all kinds of institutions. Right? So that it's very important. Here it's very, very, very crucial distinction between institutional responsibility and moral responsibility. Sometimes they are coextensive, and sometimes they are. Yeah, thanks.
Before we turn to the next question, we are like, do you have time for more questions? It's 4:30 now, and he also has to. Let me take
Catch a train.
Right.
But it's fine. Another 10 minutes maybe.
Okay. We'll limit to just one question. Go ahead, and you can then probably end with a. And I'll say my questions for later. After the question.
Hello. So, somewhere in the presentation, my question is rather about individual responsibility. So, somewhere in the presentation, I think you said that individual responsibility presupposes some sort of intentionality. Now, how far do you think that this individual responsibility and intentionality can come apart? So, can it be the case that there's an absence of intention, yet the individual can be held responsible for it? Because I remember like reading a paper by Miranda Ficker long back, like it was called Fault and No Fault Responsibility. So when an individual, like in this case, the individual cannot be held culpable for an action because you did not do the action intentionally. For example, you were like driving a car with great caution, yet you still like hit somebody with the car, right? So in this case, there's an absence of intention, and you cannot obviously hold the individual culpable, but still there's a sense of responsibility,
Yes.
which is expressed in the form of individual guilt that the
Yeah.
individual faces.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Yeah.
they come apart.
Yeah, but they can and they do. Also, there's something called moral luck. If you're familiar with literature, there's something called moral luck that happens. Luck and accidental things. Even if you don't have the intention to cause the damage, luck can interfere and make you the culprit, right? That's possible, and that's how we have these great tragedies. That's why moral philosophers take so much interest in big tragedies. So luck does make an impact there. But yes, one might going ahead with Fricker, one might say that this is a very sort of law-centric explanation of moral responsibility, and it really helps the legal sort of fraternity. But morality, as an informal institution, is involved with all kinds of things where things are not as clear as they are presented in this sort of Kantian explanation. This is, I must say, that this is very, very Kantian. Agency, intention, very sort of rationalist. I mean, that's why I have one chapter on emotions. That's how I depart from Kant and go with Hume and others, and I talk about and that's just to talk about the profile of an agency. And the profile of that agency is not just rationalist profile, but it also has that emotional side to it, and that emotional side makes it vulnerable to all kinds of moral flaws. And if that can be maintained at the individual level, I would say that can also be made at the level of the collective. Right. Yeah, I hope that answers. And
Okay. Your final comment, and then we will.
I was just wondering, you said at one point about pollution that if a person who chooses to drive a gas does probably intend to. Something like that. So, but I would make a counterclaim, which are people who choose to use plastic pens when we know there's availability of, organic materials. Like it could be wood, it could be metal with, refillable, ink, liquid ink. Basically, fountain pens. Go back 100 years. That's all people use, right? So that is, I mean,
it's also about, yeah, I get the point. Also about with respect to environment, also about whether these collective entities are able to discharge their forward-looking responsibility. Right. If the collective entities are able to discharge their forward-looking responsibility, then within the collective, the individuals can be held morally accountable in the backward-looking sense. That means if you don't have a ban on plastic bags, makes no sense to talk about individual responsibility for you.
But it makes sense to talk about moral liability to a person despite
No,
his
if
strict ban on
these,
plastic.
there are institutions which should be held accountable in the first place, right? If you have, if suppose you don't want to use plastic pen,
Correct.
but if you have no place where you can buy an alternative way of writing or sort of tools for writing purpose, this makes sense to overwhelm, right? It would be a bit too much, right? So it's about the society, whether society is really discharging its duties when these claims are made at the collective level. So that's how it is.
But what you're saying is theoretical. We do have metal pens, wood pens being sold. We do have ink bottles being sold.
We have wood pens.
Yes, I have a metal pen right here with the ink bottle, which is why
I'll buy for you.
Okay. So we can probably continue this conversation with email or from there. I thank you all for joining us for this presentation, and special thanks to the author and presenter.
Thank you.
It was a great learning experience for all of us, and we hope to have you again on campus for the discussions. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's take it first.
Sure.
Tushar, can you find robot and just hand him once? अपनी मान लिया I was not aware that this is not the answer behind it. No, I have to read it. I hope I was not not at all. It was being random for my chemistry. Nice. तो वो बंद कर दीजिए लाइट्स की और जाओ पता क्या करना